Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Natasha Reynolds, and today I'm going to be having a conversation with Dr. Oksana Yakushko as part of a series. Thank you for joining us. This is part of a series that the Psychotherapy Action Network, or PsiAN, is producing, and this is a global community of mental health professionals and stakeholders who are dedicated to promoting psychotherapies of depth, relationship, and insight. In this series, we're going to be speaking with authors, researchers, academics, policymakers, and many of whom serve as advisors to the Psychotherapy Action Network, all of whom are concerned about the current state of mental health care policies and practices at this time. We will be hearing from some important voices in our field and what they have to say about the future of psychotherapy. And for you all to know that Psychotherapy Action Network is a 100% volunteer run nonprofit, and you can learn more at PsiAN.org. So welcome, Dr. Yakushko. This is Dr. Yakushko, a licensed psychologist and psychoanalytic trainee with a focus on integration of feminist and critical perspectives in psychoanalysis within relational forms of clinical care. She is also a faculty member of the clinical psychology department at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and her published work primarily focuses on social issues, including immigration, human trafficking, xenophobia, gender issues, and the impact of historical forms of oppression. She has written on indigenous healing practices, women's spirituality, multicultural counseling approaches, and qualitative cross-cultural research methods. She's received several awards from her scholarly work and activism, including the APA Presidential Citations and the Oliva Espin Social Justice Award. In addition to her scholarly work, she's been active in the American Psychological Association, focusing on local initiatives on health and spirituality. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us and spending your time with us today. And it looks like you have done a lot of work in this field. So I'm really eager to get to know what's important to you. And I guess just to sort of frame it for the audience, what led you to join PsiAN?
So I have long, probably like many of us, have felt the impact and frustration in terms of both the perception and inclusion and importance of these psychotherapies, what we say depth and insight. And
Mhm.
I grew up Soviet, and I do remember having to hide my interests in, say, Freud and Jung because they were forbidden, Soviet style. Treatment, of course, was more what we would call here behavioral or cognitive behavioral. And then, so the hunger to know more and enter into these kind of experiences, both personally and professionally, was there for me as post-Soviet immigrant. And so, only to discover through my training and other experiences that these perspectives continue to be marginal and marginalized, and in very different forms, whether it be having been in research one academia faculty or in organizations or practice settings, or even just broader media perspectives. And
Mm.
so I felt when finding Cyan was kind of like for all of us finding our tribe or community of really like-minded individuals where we all reflect in different ways that the commitment to psychotherapy, genuine relational, insight-oriented psychotherapy, its value for others and ourselves that is continually being dismissed. The perspectives are sometimes are openly maligned, and I think the public is misinformed and is misserved, and in
Mm.
addition to being underserved. And I just felt like to find that community was so important to recognize together in different ways that we can make impact, and the more voices we bring together, the more impact we can make from different standpoints and constituent kind of representations.
Yes, yes, and it sounds like you're coming from academic interests and have experiences in academia of sort of what you were describing of limitations and what we're exposed to, what we're maybe allowed or not allowed to explore
Mhm.
in this current context. You mentioned your previous experience feeling like you had to hide your interest in more what it sounds like Jung and psychoanalytic theories. And I was
Mhm.
curious, how did you, what made you interested in that despite not being having access to um, maybe access to that kind of experience or education or being allowed to be interested in that experience as
Mhm.
well?
Mhm. You know, so some part of it is maybe I was a rebellion teen in Soviet Union, and I read Solzhenitsyn and Bulgakov, and I read Freud and Jung to some degree. But
I
so maybe
see.
it was within the umbrella. But I also feel like these depth perspective, for those of us, many of us from other cultures, there's just so much more consistent with frameworks of mind, worldviews. I mean, I certainly think like, the Dostoevsky is to me a classic depth psychologist. So, as we all kind of know. So I feel like it was very much intellectually and emotionally home. And then, having come here and having experienced both type of for myself treatment modalities when I struggled with my adjustment I immigrated entirely on my own as an immigrant. That discovering myself through the depths psychological perspectives was so incredibly
Mm,
valuable. And what
mhm,
began to be disjointed is that as I went through academia and I was, I felt like I was love academic work and intellectual work and successful in it. There were spaces in my training where not only definitely there was almost zero representation of these perspectives, they
mm,
were very openly maligned. So I
mhm.
remember being even publicly kind of set down in I remember my master's program where I was saying, how could I believe something that's by sciences has been proven not to work?
Ah,
So it's like proven not to work. Like I'm
mhm.
not just non-scientific, I'm following something like anti-scientific, like flat earth
Right.
theory.
Right.
And that it's anti-feminist, that it's anti this and anti that. And it was, I felt like there's my own experience, my own learning, my own attending of lectures and seminars, recognition of aliveness, especially to me, psychoanalytic
Mhm,
thinking, depth thinking in so many spaces.
mhm.
And so I felt like once again, it felt like Soviet Union and still sometimes feels that way to me, like that there's an official way of knowing and believing, and you have to sort of say what it is. And it's all scientific. I mean, I sometimes laugh about that because Soviet Union was nothing but just entirely scientific. US and the West were anti-scientific, capitalist, woo-woo people who were all
Uh-huh.
into money, religion, who knows what. I mean, I had education in scientific socialism, scientific atheism, scientific military education, scientific history. Everything was prefaced as scientific.
Right.
And so I felt like to kind of rediscover that science, like religion, like culture, it's a framework and there's ideology behind it. And there is a profound ideology in psychology. And so I began both to see through it, feel it. I felt like I, for a while, lived in two worlds of like just being in academia and research one academia, or having been in APA and governance and feeling like I'm in this sphere and I speak this language, and then I'm in this sphere and I speak this language. And having both in myself to feel like I don't want to have this
Mm,
divided view of myself, my work,
mhm,
psychology. So reclaiming that and then discovering histories and US psychology and histories of the profoundly disturbing ways that psychotherapy, depth perceptive, they've been mistreated, misjudged, rejected from the very beginning. So this kind of rhetoric of, oh, you're just not scientific now, or you're not this and that, it's been going on for over 100 years and it just doesn't stop. So I feel like we can, I know how scientific we are. I know what kind of science and kind of the value and unquestionable scientific validity of the work we do. But it is, if science is framed a particular way, and if science only roots itself in particular histories, epistemological perspectives, and values,
Mm,
then sure, what we do is now is not the same, but it's how it's framed and devalued. And then the language of empirical validation is still used 100
mm,
years ago. And so I began to actively kind of write and focus on that, but for myself to say, to always hold this, kind of recognition of both valuing that comes from my own personal experience, my own work, but
mm,
also really understanding of deep valuing and absolutely solid, scientific support by any standards of traditions. And what happens when these are so twisted and misaligned that the public doesn't even know this kind of paradigm or history. So that's kind of my reclaiming, my ex-Soviet reclaiming in resisted kind of way. So there's
yeah.
just multiple levels of truth and multiple levels of languaging what is real or not unreal. So
Mm, mhm, mhm. Yes, I am hearing such a, it sounds like navigating such a disconnect, not only between some of the lectures you were going to, but also your personal experience that resonated so deeply
mhm.
around therapies of depth, insight, and relationship, and how just being kind of slammed with like almost like like a alternative universe of no,
Mhm,
that's wrong, or that's unethical, or that's not scientific.
mhm,
It just being such a disconnect there that
mhm,
you
mhm,
are now you are creating that connection and trying to help
mhm,
add context to that as well.
mhm,
Yeah.
mhm,
Mhm.
mhm,
One thing that struck me, I just mentioned that I saw your lecture before, and something that really stuck out to me was a moment where you described uh, if you say science says this, it's
mhm,
really hard to grapple with that or question that, even though if we're really kind of zooming out, or I guess my own understanding of science is questioning things, it's
mhm.
asking questions, but the kind of the ideology around it of this is what science says, it feels intimidating perhaps to question that.
Oh, absolutely, right? So I feel like I'm having grown up with that, and then standing back and say, I don't dismiss what I've learned, but I have learned to critically evaluate.
Mm,
And so here, sometimes I see that there is such a quasi-religious, what other scholars call scientism. That's if you
mm,
say according to research, that's
mm,
supposed to be an unquestioned truth, even though most of us as scholars and scientists recognize that there are multiple levels in that, like you said, the part of the scientific um, um, the value of science is the capacity to question, capacity to look at different perspectives and critically evaluate, to recognize different standpoints, for science to also stand back and become aware of how science is a human social production. So it continually reproduces cultural artifacts and cultural
mm,
inequalities and so forth. So, saying according to research, women can't do science, or according to research, minorities need 3 sessions to be fixed in psychotherapy. That to me is a reproduction of very much cultural paradigms. And that can be, sure, you can prove, in my view, I feel like I see it. It's like part of it. Both 100 years ago, we could prove, women's inferiority of minorities and immigrants. And then sometimes I see the very same signs today, and they're not neutral. And what is being proven as in name of science, often by psychologists, is sometimes profoundly disturbing. And so when it then gets into science of psychotherapy and the politics and the funding and the rhetoric involved and the, kind of misrecognition of the what is, actual data, data, that relationship is the most significant and probably overarching ingredient in any psychotherapy being effective. And
mm,
then we have all kinds of other research that seems to say, oh no, you don't, you might not even need to see a human being, why relation,
Mhm.
like why not see a AI person who like kind of fixes you in 2 sessions. And so
Uh-huh.
it's just that, you can prove by research what is proven in what context for whom, for what purpose it
Mhm.
serves, what are other realities, what are other perspectives, and that's according to research just gets so dismissed. And I feel like, speaking to one side just because it fit the academic milieu of one traditionally of, kind of what I don't use that term lightly. In fact, it's very accurate, but and it also has been used before me. It's a kind of rats and stats psychology. So
Hmm.
it really is a faster approach to not just doing some kind of scholarship and then saying that applies to human beings, and it also what gets grants. And so there's kind of a loop in terms of what happens, I think, in my view, in academic settings and so forth, and then how that then translates to the public in terms of what is empirically validated. And so I
Mm,
just
mhm,
want to
mhm.
always invite us to even look at definition of scientism and wonder about when someone says according to research, and everybody's, it's supposed to be the truth somehow, that
Ah,
we,
yes.
both educate ourselves, educate the public, and enter into those discussions of whose science are we talking about, who's represented, who's not represented,
Mm,
so that
mhm,
to me is
mhm.
really important.
Yes, yeah, that
Hmm.
that context feels really important. And I guess as you were describing the push towards you use a phrase, this is a new phrase to me, rats and stats,
Hmm.
but sort of thinking about can we test something in a lab and work with some numbers around it and produce that's very quick and
Hmm.
maybe gratifies. I can empathize with the desire of like gratifying, like we want to see results, like
Hmm.
what helps. But I
Hmm.
think the foundation of what the research is maybe based on is kind of flimsy, or not, like if it's not in the room, or if it's not like based in human interaction or what we know about maybe human relationship being the foundation of our development and
Hmm.
our healing,
Hmm.
then it's maybe a little bit out of context.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I was kind of thinking, I love, because I like historical and I watch this, but here would be some examples. One would be from, kind of right key, would say voices, perspectives in our field, so 100 years, John B. Watson, produces behaviorism, which he calls American branch of natural sciences. As I write about it and I study him, John B. Watson is a card-carrying leader of American eugenic movements.
Mm.
He also, really approaches, he in his behaviorist manifesto, he proclaims there is no difference between human being and an animal, none.
Mm, I see.
And then he says in introspection and consciousness, so that would be unconsciousness or consciousness, have no role in psychology. And everything can be explained what he calls chemical physical terms. So he's interested in germoplasm or genes, so heredity,
Mm.
and then how to control that behavior. So then he produces absolutely popular, he's on Life magazine cover.
Mm.
He's the psychologist, psychology of prediction and control of human behavior. And he will, every book for parents or audience has rats brains, a discussion of what's done to rats. And then he will say things like, do not have your same-sex children ever be in a room together because that causes homosexuality, because here is what was done on dogs. And so there's just these discussions that parents and others take up from an authority that we
Mm.
have lived with. And to me, some, really problematic views of what is human behavior, what is change, what is relationship. Of course, does it not work to hurt a child as you hurt an experimental animal, and that they withdraw and they behave, and you can use it as evidence that that works.
Mm,
On
mhm.
the other hand, That's just, to me, is, we can, and Watson's children and grandchildren have spoken about how they were treated by him. So that's, kind of history we are not taught, not known, and then we often don't recognize, like, what kind of research with whom was done to produce this kind of view of human behavior, and what are the proclamations about what its values. And just to quickly take it to today, I listened to NPR a year or two ago, Yale happiness studies, well-being, all that stuff, and everyone, largest ever class, and the woman, Laurie Santos, who is right now became a spokeswoman for the positive psychology, happiness movement in psychology. It just is discussed super quickly that she begins to say that science has proven that majority of our happiness, of 50%, if you remember your statistics, predicted by your genes, the other 40% by your self-control and kind of toughen it up, and your environment doesn't matter. It's maybe 10%. Your relationships don't matter. Social class, race, nothing else matters.
Wow.
And so she's on NPR, and then the NPR Science Friday asks, tell me about, where you get your research. And she says, I'm a primatologist. So she's like, I have monkeys in cages. These monkeys in cages, they don't think about the past. They don't think about the future. They live in the now. And, I just want to invite the audience and our own community to think about the implications of both. Reread John B. Watson, including reread Little Albert studies and others, and the how, in my view, problematic, sometimes sadistic research done and its implications, and then listen to what is represented as research in science today to the public. And when it's becomes really, really powerful and very well funded and very well promoted, and how do we listen to what are the assumptions that translate to us being very human people, living very human life within the context of our human lives. And, to be told that neither that context nor our relationships matter. So how do we reconcile these kind of, traditions, and who gets to speak about what it means to be human? Yes. So that's to me is, again, examples of it's both in our field, it's psychology, it's what lived then and lives now. And so I try to kind of think and write about and see it in my practice all the time, just, if monkeys are happy, why am I not happy? And so forth, So anyhow, so that's considering these facts and science of psychology.
I see. So you've mentioned John B. Watson a couple of times as, I think you said, the father of behaviorism. And I was wondering if you could kind of add a little context, why is he important today? What did he influence or impact that impacts our current science, or I guess American psychology?
Right. Yeah. So those of course, for most of us outside or inside psychology, it's the perspective that gets introduced as most scientifically valid. And, every one of us knows Little Albert. And so just to remind you, John B. Watson is a, scholar. His Behaviors Manifesto is, he delivers it and publishes a book about it in 1914. And Little Albert study is done in 1919 or so. The Little Albert publication comes out 1920. And so it becomes the most dominant form of psychological viewing of human behavior, that human behavior could be kind of dissected along the lines of caged animal behavior, and then to be predicted and controlled. So that's actually a classic eugenic phrase of we human engineer, social engineer human beings, and we do it through prediction and control. So so that those of you who reread, I always feel like rather we've gotten fed so many histories about John B. Watson and what it was and what it wasn't. And I recommend going and reading the man himself. And so
Mhm.
that, begins to be, but where it begins to, really constellate, he's not, of course, the only one. And he's within community of psychologists here in the US who all study humans through animals, experimental
Mhm. Mhm.
animals. And so behaviorism remains, in my view, the continuous, it's American, the most dominant perspective practice to today. And cognitive behaviorism is added sometimes in the 60s, 70s. Again, the person who often promotes that he scientifically proved the validity of cognitive behavior is Martin Seligman, does it through learned helplessness studies on tortured experimental dogs. And so
Mm.
I think there's just these kind of patterns of quick change, control, thought control, behavior control that just kind of permeate American psychology. In the meanwhile, this very same time, from John B. Watson to today, these very same individuals absolutely hate depth perspectives.
Mm.
It's not an exaggeration. John B. Watson, calls it voodooism. They call it a cult.
Mm. Mhm.
Stanley Hall, founder of US Psychology and APA, says, we're going to plunge in the depth of down the evolutionary ladder if we, it's race suicide if we follow, psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis and other traditions of depth were excluded from all positions of authority. They were not invited in academia. John B. Watson says, these psychoanalytic people, they've created so much research and so much scientific writing. You can fill rooms with their writings. He says this in 1930. But he says it's completely wrong. It's completely wrong. And he says analysis doesn't work. Analysis is not valuable. It's only genetic control of behavior, he says. This is only thing, it would be like a doctor prescribing, and this is what we do.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
they continually, I call it, sometimes I joke that Freud bashing, and so surprising, like Freud changed Freud as he went. But there's this Freud bashing, which I believe is professional sport in psychology. And you just go at like bash Freud, and with it anything that you think connected to Freud. And so then
I see.
it's become what is now. So you read Martin Seligman's contribution, like up, you know, authentic happiness and his other, positive psychological stuff. In each book attacks psychoanalysis. Each book
Mm.
calls depth practitioners a legion of followers of Freud followers, and
Mm. Mhm.
just like it and says that it's been proven not to work, and da 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 da,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
it's so non-scientific, in fact non-scientific, and it's so not based in reality that it's published, and it's like he says been translated to 30 languages. So it's another one of my concerns of how that research psychology promotes itself globally as the only true psychology, and so forth. And so I just holding these kind of histories of Freud bashing, psychotherapy in psychology doesn't appear to be valued until World War II ends.
Mm.
And because psychotherapy was practiced by psychiatrists who were psychoanalytic, and it's just testing. It's a lot of testing, some moral control, behavioral control of children. That's the, and a lot of animal research. That's psychology. And then come, existential perspectives, humanistic perspectives, all of that begins to
Mm.
occur around the kind of break from eugenics, in my view, and break from that kind of psychology of control around World War II in relation to revelation of centrality of eugenics to Nazism, and so, everyone distances, themselves, but nevertheless, my perspective that those traditions are strong, continue, and people continue to come out of the woods supporting these kind of views of humanity. But in practice of psychology, that is such a dominant perspective, and there's also still this commitment to bash Freud and to bash
Mm.
depth traditions.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
okay, so I'll add to all of you listeners my other kind of there's some other stunning research. People like Norcross, for example, John Norcross, do studies every 10 years to check with psychologists themselves whether they seek their own treatment and with
Mm.
whom.
Mhm.
And it is absolutely revealing because the more behaviorist you are, the least likely you go to one of your people. So I think you found something like less than 10% of behaviorists will ever go to another behaviorist for treatment. In cognitive behavioral therapy, less than, I think, 17% will
Mm.
go to one of their own kind for treatment. Where everybody goes is to depth psychologist.
Ah,
So for
mhm,
our traditions, so for example, he made it umbrella all of like psychodynamic, psychoanalytic traditions,
mhm,
saying it's over 90% of us will go only to, because we know it works. And his conclusion is that they too, that they will go to treatment with us. So I often find like it's such a disingenuous, it's like saying, for those people, there's that kind of vaccine for COVID. But for us, we're special,
I see.
these
Mhm,
people need behaviorism. We need three sections of controlling their thoughts and behaviors. For us, we need relational therapy. We need good, time to work through things. So, we deserve it. Those people
mhm,
need those kind of traditions. And so
mhm,
just want to invite us to, I keep kind of thinking ways that the history we've inherited in especially American and Western traditions of, uh, kind of truly it's rats and stats psychologies. And it is an extremely common way of doing research in what's supposed to be human behavior and human experience and not human science traditions, disparaging depth tradition, making them evil, over sexual, cultish, voodooism, as Watson called to then and now, and then to hide the fact, one once begins to listen, that these very same individuals for themselves will choose to come to depth traditions. And I think that to me is an unacceptable state of of the field. And that's, I in my view feel like that's what we are all experiencing and facing in different ways.
I
Mhm,
see. Yes.
mhm,
A lot of what you described, this disconnect between what one advocates for and says or bashes, um, is so disconnected with what one does. I guess I just keep hearing politics, and
mhm.
maybe how political these, or maybe, I guess it's no surprise, but how political an academic environment can be as well, and how that then impacts what science, who defines science, and what science, how science then
Mhm.
impacts communities, as well.
Yes, yeah. I feel like for all of us, of course, we are aware of it, but nevertheless, we think there's something. It happened in Soviet Union that right, any practice was controlled by the state. But it's tough to, for Americans or others, now that I am American, to kind of for us to recognize the power of politics, economic realities, kind of capitalist competition, and to me also really embedded structural
Mm,
inequalities
mhm,
that are especially racial, especially and because racialized and gendered inequalities are then economic, right? It's economic. And
mm,
so who can have
mhm,
access to what kind of treatment and who can afford different kinds of treatment becomes also another layer of, right, kind of rhetoric. But just to remind again, back to history. So John B. Watson and all those people who were founding Thorndike, Yerkes, Terman, Brigham, these are all Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford individuals running their APA presidents and so forth. So they
mhm, mhm,
get connected with the government and the power of a government through Department of Defense. They do these big studies. They get visibility. They enter politics. They
mhm,
become heads of research councils that distributes money. And so it becomes a club. They're all kind of like in it together, and it's an exclusion club.
mm,
They,
mhm,
when they don't like, these other perspectives, you can just brand it non-scientific, say it's, anti-American, and which also was another in the 50s, because especially, like say Eric Erickson, we are like, oh, developmental or staunchly psychoanalytic guy, and he's asked to sign McCarthyan loyalty oath at Berkeley because many psychoanalysts also happen to be socialists and also very actively politically active. So how politics, who works with politicians to, kind of control testing of the military, testing in schools, like how do you, those, that's the history. And then who actually actively fights against access to therapy, injustice, in some ways, like those histories are really veiled and not seen. And so like Eric Erickson refuses to sign loyalty oath, the McCarthy, and that he, and he leaves Berkeley and he goes to psychoanalytic Austin Ricks Hospital and works the rest of his life. So it's just, so that's a very practical way politics enter, but we can just see it so many ways where then academics working with government structures, access to national and private funding, and so forth. It's just becomes, and then insurance comes in, and those of us and you, and all of you who've been in the field, and when you have health management organization that will pick up anything and will support anything and fund anything that can prove that there's one way of working and working fast, and it's, it just becomes a loop, reinforced loop of rhetoric about science and what works and what doesn't, and then most of us know it doesn't. And most people, like now science kind of shows there's such evidence throughout, like you can't do that kind of work with, individuals for a variety of reasons when there is no that relational base, which does not take 3 sessions to establish. And, and we're not rats in cages or monkeys in, in cages, that we are complex human beings with very complex social realities, that if we don't have space for that, what does it mean for our practices, and who pays for what, and who gets in academic settings, and what gets published then, right? And so what gets funded, and it becomes, so how do we, I feel like with PsiAN and all of our voices, we've had our individual discontent, and I hope through shared kind of political activism, professional activism, from historical recognition, from our writing, from scholars who do research to show things, we can come together to just really begin to reshape this kind of history and narratives and rhetoric, and really offer an alternative perspective that public could really recognize, and then make informed choices versus being told that this is the only thing that works.
Yes, yeah. And I may be biased, but a perspective that I think maybe feels very intuitive to people. I'm teaching, I've been teaching a class on basic psychodynamic theory and intervention. And so many of the students who are coming into the class have had either no history or no background in psychoanalysis, or what they learned in their undergraduates were maybe undergraduate programs were maybe this was Freud and now he's bunk, like now that's over. And that's the extent of the exposure. And so I think that when I start the class off, I ask, what do you imagine? What do you imagine in the room if you were to go to therapy today? Like, what do you expect? What do you imagine? And often the kinds of things that come up are, I want to talk, I want to get to know, I want someone to know me, I want to know myself by talking about it and exploring myself. And I'm thinking, yeah, depth, relationship, insight, yes, all of these. And that's intuitive to most people. So this bunk thing is really got something to it.
Yes, yeah.
And I think another thing that sticks out too is that there have been in the context of psychoanalytic history, there's been a lot of changes and shifts and growth in the schools of thought within psychoanalysis. I even one of the comments that you made about behaviorism sort of saying like, oh, all those analysts are just, cultish and voodoo. And I was sort of thinking, I wonder if that's what it was like early, in early psychoanalytic schools of thought when it was growing and developing, that even t- towards change, like there was some infighting as well of,
Oh,
well,
absolutely.
yeah, how do we
Hmm.
understand people? And maybe there are different perspectives
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
understanding.
So, right, psychoanalysis like moved on. Freud moved on from Freud as Freud develops, and then other people have certainly moved away. And it's such a large umbrella, and it's so truly talk about dynamics. Dynamic. There's so many directions and perspectives, and it's to me is vital because it is taken up in cultures outside the West, and it is much more common framework for understanding psychology of human life in Latin America and Africa, in Asia, just like it's and I also, I here's like talk about Freud. I because I write on eugenics, I looked up, just uh, history of so Freud studies in Vienna. He's a neurologist, he's a doctor, he studies with other people, he's incredibly bright, people recognize it. We can agree disagree with his perspectives now and so forth, but he what begins to happen, and that he tries to apply with his colleagues for positions, academic positions at the very same University of Vienna, and he's denied posts. And how he's denied posts, and I've been looking at that, and it's like very early, and then to find these people in eugenic groups in Austria was fascinating. They tell him that he's just an unpleasant man, that he's, and then they go on and on to prove themselves to be anti-Semitic. And I sometimes think, he was just such a nasty woman, and you could
Wow.
just, it's like beginning to now, how things get framed, people get framed, and then how do they find themselves on the margins, and how do they react?
Mhm.
How is to understand that early psychoanalytic, that it was both attacked, as Jewish science, and attacked as psychoanalysis, and attacked as this and that. So understand it, and that they were occupying kind of a marginal perspective for social political reasons. And
Mm.
so how does that, we begin to kind of paying attention, because psychoanalysis is alive and well, as most of you know, if you're
Mhm.
not familiar, in all kinds of disciplines that should be something we study and are adjacent to us. So, feminist theory, queer theory, racial theory, communication studies, historians, so forth. There's such
Mhm.
a vibrancy of psychoanalytic thinking and writing
Mhm.
in all kinds of perspective. I am a huge anti-colonial, post-decolonial traditions, liberation psychology person. It is all psychoanalytic.
Mm.
Entirely, without
Mhm.
psychoanalysis, you can't understand Fanon, and you can't read Martin Barreau Freire. But people, they try to strip them and say they, whatever they do. But they are Fanon was a psychoanalyst in Africa. So, I'm just trying to kind of recognize with us where psychoanalysis is alive and well as a in practice, but we kind of not permit, we all, we're all kind of marginalized, and we're hiding it, and it's to me, it's vibrant, it's alive, people, it's there, we're all practicing, and people come to us, we all
Yes.
recognize this, and data shows the same, and it's alive, and many traditions that to me are vital to understanding human experience.
Uh-huh.
But how do we come to research in psychology and empirical validation of particular views and perspectives that kind of remain staunchly constellated around one particular view that gets, or one set of views that gets kind of and travels, and there's just the variations, it remains the same.
Mm.
And so unquestioned kind of assumptions about what it means to be human, what it means to be working with humanity and complexity, and what it means, the kind of ethnocentric, our research is bigger and better than anything out there, whether it's non-Western or indigenous traditions. And we just kind of, that's what's embodied in the kind of practice the words practice, and
Yeah.
science the words practice. And I feel, hopefully there's some real pushback towards those kind of historical paradigms and recognition, as you said, of what is truly human and living.
Mm, mhm,
And if
mhm,
those very students in our community of professionals, if
mhm,
they're this is what they're seeking, I think it would only be honest that they really learn and offer this also, this kind of gift, this kind of perspective, this kind of
mm,
experience to all others they work with, and
mhm,
don't excuse that they have a empirically valid view that asks them to actually not offer something that they themselves know is healing. And
yeah.
that to me is like, that's we you know those people and us deserve the same vaccines,
Mhm,
in
mhm,
my view,
mhm.
it's like, we can't have vaccine for them, vaccine for us, whatever, if we use COVID analogy. But
Yes, yeah.
we all, what works for them, for us, for all of us, we're in it together, and we have to figure out how to
Mhm,
navigate the kind of traumas and hurts and problems, and sometimes just genuine just struggles of being human,
mm,
right?
mhm,
And so
mhm.
that's to me is, commitment I wish I feel would make, but nevertheless, we're kind of a little we just like we're
Yes.
not there yet. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, working to get there. And what struck me about, as you were describing that, was just how the discrepancy between words and actions, and that I hear you saying like psychoanalysis is alive and well in so many different fields. Like we see it come alive, and we see it in our offices. We see people, coming in and seeking this. We ourselves as a field seek this, and yet the word, putting a name to it, feels um, rebellious, or if it
Hmm.
feels like that's off limits in some ways. And I'm sort of just thinking about that seems so psychodynamic, right? That
Yeah,
that the
yeah, yeah.
behavior and the words don't quite make sense, or don't quite mesh together. And how do we make sense of what's going on in between that? Um,
Exactly. Yeah. What is, right? Repressed, denied, forbidden, projected. And I had this image of, like, when you said it, I have the memory of reading Freud on the metro in Soviet Union, and like hiding that I was reading Freud. And I feel like, it feels sad, but so many of us feel like we have to somehow navigate hiding
hmm,
our
mhm,
commitments, even
mhm,
if we might not hide in one space. Many of us, just to name it, we have to hide when we write to insurances. We have to
mhm,
hide when we're given list of what we offer, and
mhm,
psychodynamic will either not be there or be there marginally.
mhm,
And everything else is like behavioral this, behavioral that, behavioral
mhm.
this, behavioral that, cognitive this. There's so many variations, and we feel invisible, and how it feels to, like, well, I need to get paid, and I need to have patience, and I need to have an academic post,
Right, right,
and
yeah,
I need, oh, just you kind of fit yourself into categories created by others. And it's
right.
tough because it's also our livelihood, and it's our right. And anyhow, it just gets to be, how we struggle individually, privately, and how do we join forces and give voice to this kind of right. f- Reading Freud and hiding on a
Mhm.
metro, like, hopefully nobody sees that I'm reading this, like, censored material, and Soviet Union,
Yes. Oh
so
man, what
mhm.
a lovely and powerful image there. But yeah, I'm hearing it. You're talking. I think I'm hearing like rebranding in a way, almost like an attempt to rebrand in a way that feels ethical, and aligns, but also just like grappling with those tensions of how do I say what I'm trying to say without saying that what I can't say.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes. Yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
maybe part of it is PsiAN. It's like, right, it's the same as communities of resistance, which I love the idea of communities of resistance, kind of both from decolonial liberation and other traditions. But part of it, right, is this, as you said, psychodynamically, psychoanalytically speaking, the kind of importance of position, of um, capacity to develop one's own voice, self, to feel that safety in the world, that kind of right, that kind of relational capacities to be maybe like you said, I mean, there's something there, just we as a field, also retake up what was disassociated, traumatized,
Mm,
where, in some my view, we also, like Ferengi's work, we often identify with the aggressor. We're like,
mm, mhm,
if only I was more scientific, I
mhm,
would be better. But
mhm,
it just, we are scientific, right? It's a identification with that voice that says we're
mhm.
somehow not good enough. And
Ah,
I feel like now take up the understanding of how very, very scientific, even more scientific that sometimes those traditions we really have been and are, and
mm, mhm,
re-engage with that kind of capacity to not be projected into and split off, and identify with this kind of paradigm that we really, you know we're really, just boutique, worried well, which we're not at
mm.
all. And
Right,
what kind of gets
right.
pushed into us, and somehow we don't resist and say, no, 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 that's not reality. We're
Yeah.
not going to have this confusion of tongues. We're
Mm,
going to
mhm,
not
mhm,
identify with the aggressor. We're going to stand our ground and know what we offer, and how we take up science, how we take up practice,
mhm,
and
mhm,
be present for our own full self in the
mm,
world. And
mhm.
that's, to me, it's like would be whew, wonderful
Yes.
as a field, right?
Yes. Wow.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm with you. I felt that shiver too.
Uh-huh.
And we're kind of already talking on this, but I did want to ask directly, what is your hope for the future of psychotherapy? If you had the power and the resources, like what is your vision and your hope?
Medicare for all with psychotherapy and depth psychotherapy, psychotherapy of depth, insight, and relationship being affordable and available to all. Just that it is, that people are informed about their choices and are given, not then, um, kind of like the side homage that, oh, you can choose whatever therapy you want. If it's not paid for and it's not
Mm, mhm,
supported, then I don't think that is. It's like saying, we women we can be anything we want to be, except that
mm,
there's like real concrete ceiling about all of that.
right.
So I just want to kind of, I think, my vision would be that it's made, that our training institutions, including and especially American Psychological Association, for me as psychologist, for those of us as psychologists,
Mm,
that says that it licenses and accredits programs that give healing and psychological help to people and communities, and where psychotherapy is not taught. And
mm,
that
mhm,
access to training and theoretically diverse psychotherapies is not offered. And the kind of monocultural view of what is psychology is made to be a status quo, standard. And that really, I feel, so my, if I had a fantasy, is
yes.
that from various, from high school psychology, where psychology is presented one way, to undergraduate to graduate psychology, the genuine forms of diverse theoretical
Mm,
perspectives and
mhm,
psychotherapies are offered and taught and very actively promoted, that kind of, that then practitioners are permitted, both financially, insurance wise, in
mhm.
communities, to genuinely practice diverse forms of psychotherapy without hiding or pretending that they are doing something else.
Yes.
Sometimes, as we are asked to do, that the media and others and politicians are informed about the profound value of diverse forms of psychotherapy for diverse communities. And then that to me feels like really genuine access to a diverse, important forms of psychotherapeutic knowledge and practice are accessible to all. I
Mm,
think, to me, is just would be a wonderful future. If we get there, I don't know. It just, we all have to kind of buckle up and fight back, because it's I feel like when I read 100 years ago what American Psychological Association and its journals published and did,
mhm.
and what in some ways happens now, and what is published and is being done, is so eerie similar. And I feel like it's, to me, how do we learn from history, how do we recognize it, and how do we, you know um recognize forms of resistance then and maybe build forms of resistance now. And I
Yeah.
don't know. So that's another word that we kind of very in dynamic relational ways come to also resist these narratives. Um,
Mm, mhm, mhm.
so that might be, yeah. So I don't know. That's like my
Yes.
fantasy vision. Yeah.
Yes, yes,
Mhm.
and I thank you so much for teaching us, teaching me today about, some of the context that's in between, some of the historical perspective that's in between, and also your hopes for the future of. I just want to underline, like, offering diverse perspectives and orientations for diverse communities, so
Mhm.
our words can align with our actions as well.
Exactly.
Yes,
Mhm.
I hear you.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well,
It just my yeah.
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 Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate our hour together and learning a lot. And I look forward to seeing your work continue, and we'll be together in this resistance.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Reynolds, and thank you for running and setting it up. To all of us in PsiAN, gratitude for different ways we work together, and
Yeah.
yeah, we just uh, care and support, and also just recognition that, especially in these times of both COVID and
Mm,
recognition of injustice in new ways, that we both need each other and we need our traditions and theories to
mm,
come, together as a healing force of resistance. And I just really like to send my care to everybody who I know personally has done this work with their full hearts and minds and bodies, and to you as well. Just
yeah.
thank
Well,
you.
thank you.
Yeah.